plains of northern Mexico stretched under a heavy, bruised sky, dark clouds rolling in with the scent of rain and dust. The wind was unusually still for an evening like this, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. On the edge of a vast field, an old, isolated farmhouse stood like a forgotten sentinel. Its roof sagged from years of disrepair, and its windows, framed by chipped wood, flickered with the faint glow of a single lantern inside. Carlos sat at the kitchen table, his elbows propped up, staring at the bottle of mezcal before him. His face was drawn, tired, and his eyes, bloodshot from too many restless nights, flickered to the window every few seconds. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but something else had. A quiet unease, one that settled deep in his bones, making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He poured another shot of mezcal, the liquid sloshing in the glass as his hand trembled slightly. It wasn't fear, he told himself, just the drink. But as the warmth of the liquor spread through his chest, the tension in his gut only grew. He stared into the amber liquid, trying to drown the unease. But the stories, the old, half-forgotten tales his grandmother used to tell him, crawled out from the corners of his mind, unwelcome. Carlos had never been a man of superstition, not like his abuela, who would sit by the fire and whisper warnings about creatures that roamed the night. Spirits and demons, cursed souls who walked the earth to punish the wicked. He'd always laughed it off as nonsense, relics of an older, more fearful time. But tonight, alone in the farmhouse, the silence pressing in like a shroud, he couldn't laugh it off anymore. The mezcal burned its way down his throat, warming him momentarily, but that creeping feeling of being watched only intensified. The wind outside had stopped completely. No rustle of grass, no clattering of old shutters, nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the faint crackle of the lantern. He swallowed hard and glanced toward the door. Then he heard it. A faint whistle. Carlos froze, the bottle halfway to his lips. The whistle was sharp and high-pitched, just on the edge of hearing, like a distant bird's call. But there was something off about it. The melody seemed out of place, unnatural. It floated on the air, carried in by the non-existent wind, and despite its distance, it sent a chill crawling up Carlos's spine. He sat motionless, straining his ears to catch the sound again. The whistle came again, closer this time. A strange, lilting tune that twisted and turned in ways that felt wrong. Carlos slowly lowered the bottle, his fingers slick with sweat, and pushed himself away from the table. He stood and moved toward the window, peering through the dirty glass into the darkening landscape beyond. Nothing moved. The field stretched out in front of him, empty and lifeless, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. There was no sign of anything unusual, no movement among the trees, no figures in the distance. Just the quiet, waiting land. Carlos let out a breath, his muscles relaxing just slightly. Maybe it was just his imagination. Too much mezcal, too many old ghost stories rattling around in his brain. Then, the whistle came again, closer, louder. His heart stuttered. The sound shouldn't have moved so fast. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. The stories, his grandmother's stories, spun in his head like a whirlwind. El Silbón, the whistler, the cursed soul who wandered the plains, dragging his sack of bones behind him, hunting for the wicked. Hunting for men like him. Carlos shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts. No, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was just a tale to scare children, a way to keep them in line. But still, the whistle, so unnatural, so wrong, sent a fresh wave of fear crawling up his throat. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the small room as if expecting something, anything, to reveal itself. He tried to focus, to breathe. But the whistle pierced the air once more, so close now it seemed to vibrate in his skull. Carlos cursed under his breath, grabbing the bottle of mezcal and downing another burning shot. He slammed the bottle onto the table, his hands shaking now, the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. He needed to calm down, to clear his head, but that sound, it wouldn't stop. And then, the door rattled. Carlos's heart lurched in his chest. The door, thick and old, shook on its hinges, as if something outside was testing it. He stared at it, every muscle in his body tensing. The whistle came again, but this time it wasn't from outside. It was inside. The sound echoed through the walls, filling the small room, circling him like a predator toying with its prey. The door rattled again, harder now, as if someone, or something, was trying to open it. Carlos stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair behind him. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, his eyes fixed on the door. The knob twisted slowly, a soft creak breaking the tense silence. Then, with a slow, deliberate groan, the door swung open. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its silhouette barely visible in the fading light of the lantern. The man, if it was a man, wore tattered clothes that hung from his emaciated frame like rags. His face, gaunt and pale, was obscured by the shadows, but his eyes gleamed with an icy, unnatural glow. In one bony hand, he clutched a large, heavy burlap sack, stained dark with old blood. The sack sagged as if it was weighed down with something gruesome, something unspeakable. Carlos's blood ran cold. He tried to speak, but his throat had closed up. The figure stepped forward, dragging the sack behind him, the sound of it scraping against the wooden floor like nails on a coffin lid. His movements were slow, deliberate, and as he entered the room, the temperature seemed to plummet. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive presence that made Carlos's skin crawl. The whistling started again, but this time it was louder, sharper, as if it was coming from within Carlos's own head. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't stop. The sound drilled into his mind, relentless and cruel. The figure inched closer, his hollow eyes locked onto Carlos, his expression unreadable. You're not real," Carlos choked out, but the words rang hollow in his ears. He didn't believe them himself. His grandmother's stories filled his mind now, vivid and terrible. El Silbón, the cursed soul doomed to wander the plains, seeking vengeance, seeking souls to drag into the afterlife. The figure said nothing, but his mouth twisted into a sickening grin, exposing sharp, yellowed teeth. He raised the sack and let it fall to the floor with a wet, heavy thud. Carlos flinched at the sound, his body trembling as he tried to back away, but his legs refused to move. His entire body felt as if it had been seized by an icy hand, paralyzed with terror. El Silbón crouched beside the sack, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. He untied the sack's frayed rope and reached inside, pulling out a bundle of bones, each one stained dark with age. Carlos's stomach lurched as the figure began to arrange the bones on the floor, one by one, in the shape of a human skeleton. The whistle never ceased, its haunting melody filling the air like a dirge. Carlos watched in horror as the figure laid out the bones, his hands moving with an eerie precision. The bones seemed to gleam in the dim light of the lantern, their brittle edges sharp and jagged. When the figure finished, he knelt beside the skeletal remains, his head bowed in a grotesque display of reverence. Carlos couldn't take it anymore. His legs finally obeyed him, and he bolted for the door. His heart pounded in his chest, his pulse roaring in his ears as he flung the door open and ran into the night. The whistle followed him, growing louder and more frantic with every step, as if the figure was right behind him, just out of sight. He ran through the fields, the tall grass whipping against his legs, the ground uneven beneath his feet. His breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning as he pushed himself harder, faster. But no matter how far he ran, the whistle was always there, always just behind him. Then he saw them, the bones, scattered across the field, half buried in the earth. Human bones, some old and brittle, others fresh and gleaming white. The field was littered with them, a graveyard of the lost, the damned. Carlos stumbled, his foot catching on something hard, and he fell to the ground, his hands sinking into the dirt beside a skull. He looked up, and standing in front of him, silhouetted against the dark sky, was El Silbón. His skeletal figure loomed over Carlos, his eyes glowing with that cold, unnatural light. The whistling grew louder, shriller, as if it was ripping through Carlos's skull. He clutched his head, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. It felt like the air around him was vibrating, the melody distorting his thoughts, warping his sense of reality. El Silbón took a slow, deliberate step toward him, his bony fingers outstretched. Carlos tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mouth opened, but his voice was swallowed by the shrieking whistle that filled the air. The figure's cold, skeletal hand reached out and brushed against Carlos's forehead. In that moment, Carlos's mind was flooded with images of bodies left to rot in the fields, of families torn apart, of vengeance that spanned centuries. He saw the young man, once proud and arrogant, who had murdered his own father, only to be cursed, to wander the earth forever, bearing the weight of his father's bones in a sack of eternal torment. Carlos gasped, his chest tightening as his vision blurred. He knew now. There was no escape from El Silbón. There never had been. The whistle was a call to judgment, and his time had come. El Silbón's grip tightened, and Carlos felt his soul being ripped from his body, pulled into the cold, unforgiving darkness. His limbs went limp, his heart stuttering in his chest as the world around him faded into nothing but the endless, echoing whistle. As the last breath left his body, the cursed spirit of El Silbón turned and began to walk away, dragging his sack of bones behind him. The wind picked up again, rustling through the grass, as if nature itself was exhaling, relieved that the judgment had passed. But somewhere, deep in the distance, the faint, haunting whistle started again, and it would continue, seeking out the next soul,